There we go.
Hello, welcome to the session today. Asian Americans and Canadians, Identity, Attachment, and Trust. And your speakers today are Professor Min Zhu at the University UCLA in Los Angeles, California, and Jack Jedwab, the president of the Association for Canadian Studies in Metropolis in Montreal. And yes, they'll be sharing findings on the issues of attachment, trust, and intergroup relations. And we'll get started first with Jack, and then you'll hear from Min Zhu. And following that, feel free to answer questions in the chat or using the Q&A. Over to you, Jack.
That was great. Thanks so much, Jill. We just seconded Jill to this very last second role, realizing that it was the two of us, Min and myself. So, thanks for stepping in. And apparently, since we have additional time because Paul Ong is not able to join us, I'm going to speak more slowly. I know some of you are unaccustomed to that, that are currently on the session and who are familiar with me. I noticed some people that who I know personally, and so this is something you'll have to get used to, and hopefully, the rhythm of it will not be a problem for those of you, who are used to me like talking more like this, where I'm sort of going through all the slides really quickly, and I'm like 1, 2, 3, and that's it. So this will be a little slower pace. So let me bring up the presentation. We can even joke around more right now that we've got more time. Basically, right, Asian Americans and Chinese Canadians in the area of COVID. Attachment, trust, and intergroup relations. So we are going to jump to the slide, but before as you're looking at the slide, right, I wanted to just give a bit of background. The survey data is rising from our CIHR project, our Canadian Institute for Health Research initiative, which is and this is the second wave of the survey. We'll have up to about 6 waves, we believe, over the next 9 months. And those waves contain oversamples for Indigenous communities in Canada, United States, and Mexico, for various visible minorities, and for newcomers. And there's been a bit of a rotation in terms of the questions, so that in the first wave, we focused on discrimination issues. In the second wave, we focused on issues of attachment, trust, and intergroup relations. And in the third wave, we'll revert back to discrimination, but we are going to continue tracking the issues of attachment, trust, and intergroup relations and discrimination. Now, when I say we ask those questions, those are a few questions that are situated in the context of a much broader survey on multiple aspects of COVID, both socially and economically. So, whereas I'm going to present data that tries to situate you in this case, Asians in the United States, Chinese in Canada, and other groups, and the broader portrait, if you like, or results from the survey on attachment, intergroup relations, and trust. What is interesting and important here is that we're not coming into this presentation with data prior to COVID, right? So we can't do the comparison of whether at this point COVID-19 diminished attachment, both at these various levels of geography or culture, or for the particular communities. Though we do have data, to be fair, on the broader attachment issues. I'm gonna have to take a 1-second break here, believe it or not, because I'm at my house and some people are screaming in the background. Excuse me, I'm on a conference. Thank you. Okay. Now that's something you don't see at most presentations. So, on the first slide, so ideally you'd want to have that comparison between what happened before COVID, what happened during COVID in terms of attachment, and what happened after COVID. And we know that in the case of Asian and communities in the US and Chinese communities in Canada, that certainly there was a high jump in discrimination, in racism, in expressions of hate. We've got a fair bit of data that other scholars have gathered through social media on that phenomenon. But ideally we want to be able to look at that relationship, between attachment and how discrimination or feelings of discrimination are affecting one's attachment to both various national geographies at different levels and or identity markers. So with that said, I'm going to present you this snapshot from the March survey. It was done over the month, more or less, March 15th to 29th. We began with pre-testing earlier in the month. And basically what it shows you, and this is for the sort of broader context, with respect to those people who are saying they're very attached. Americans 58%, Canadians 54.6%, Mexico 60.3%. Now, again, this is very attached, right? Because usually we have a 4-point scale in attachments. So if you collect the very and somewhat attached, you'll get higher percentages, and you'll conclude that there are high levels of overall attachment to each of the 3 countries. But in terms of the very or most attached, if you like, segment of the population, these are the figures we're getting: 58, 54, and 60 for the 3 countries, which actually, to be fair, since I'm familiar with the data, is not far removed from what we've seen prior to COVID. So COVID hasn't resulted, at least nationally, not on a group basis, not on a group by group basis. It hasn't resulted nationally in much difference in levels of attachment to country. I do put out here that the distinction between the English Canadians and Francophone Canadians, right, where we know that in Canada there is a movement within my home province of Quebec amongst Francophones who are more Quebec nationalists, some of whom are for the separation of Quebec from Canada. So they have disproportionately lower rates of attachment to Canada, which brings this figure down, right? So by and large, there's not much difference between the 3 countries in terms of the extent to which they're very attached to the country. In terms of province or state, that didn't apply in Mexico. A 5-point difference, Canadians a bit more attached to the province or state, but even there, that is probably also a function of the English-French distinction, with Francophones being a little bit more attached to province. So not much distinction there. Not much distinction in terms of attachments to city or neighborhood across the 3 countries, and as regards the very attached. Some difference in terms of ethnic or racial racialized or racial attachments, not between Canada and Mexico, but not between US and Mexico, but where Canada is concerned, there's less attachment to ethnic or racial identities. Language groups, actually Canada is showing lower in terms of the very attached than are US or Mexico. And religion, not surprisingly, United States is higher in terms of attachment to religion, Canada the lowest, and Mexico in between. Canada, again, there's a distinction in English and French. English generally are a little higher in terms of religious attachments than French, so that's probably bringing that number down. Now we break it down by immigrant, non-immigrant. We can see in terms of attachment to country, United States, non-immigrants 18 points higher in terms of attachment to country relative to immigrants. In Canada, it's a 5-point difference. And in Mexico, a 15-point difference. So the sample size is a lot lower in Mexico for immigrants than it would be in Canada, United States. And keeping in mind the demographics are very different between the 3 countries, which we'll see shortly. So we won't be seeing more about Mexico on the slides going forward. For provincial attachments, a bit, again, a 10-point difference between non-immigrants and immigrants in the United States. Similar in Canada for provincial or state attachments. State, the United States, of course. City, neighborhood, few point difference in the United States. Immigrants are more attached to city or neighborhood, curiously, in Canada than non-immigrants are. Ethnic and racial communities, 5-point attachments, United States between non-immigrants and immigrants. Not a big difference in Canada, a bit inversed. Homeland or country of origin, that only applies to the immigrant population, of course. In Canada, United States, about the same. Language groups, well, much more in non-immigrants, more attached to their language community than immigrants are, about the same in Canada between immigrant and non-immigrant. A difference in Mexico, but again, the sample's small here. And religious attachments are higher amongst non-immigrants and immigrants in the United States. The opposite in Canada, which is an interesting phenomenon. Much more attachment amongst immigrants to religion than amongst non-immigrants. So speaking to the very different patterns around religion in these two countries. And in Mexico, there's also a difference between non-immigrants and immigrants, although again, I want to be careful about that data. Let me just flip back here, because the other thing we want to look at is, the extent to which going down this way, right, as opposed to horizontally, vertically, we can see that country attachments are the strongest attachments amongst those who say they're very attached in Canada, in the United States, United States for both, in Canada as well, right? And so country attachments are high, much higher, 20 points higher than attachments to country of origin on the very attached, that is to say. Here, about 9 points higher in the United States. So it's worth noting, because sometimes we'll hear from observers and analysts and pundits that immigrants are more attached to their countries of origin than to Canada or United States, respectively, and the data doesn't show that that's the case. So, or some people will argue that it takes time for immigrants to become attached to their countries of origin, and there's also not a lot of sort of strong evidence showing that that attachments, or the extent to which people are very attached, grows over time. Very often people can, within a very short period of time, feel very attached to a particular place. And in fact, over time, that attachment may decline as much as it increases. So now we're looking at, focused on Asian Americans and the Chinese Canadians. So when we look at this here, you can see that, again, disaggregated on the basis of racial identifications. The terminology used in the United States, we don't use the same terminology, but in any event, we can see that attachments are higher for the to country, at least in terms of the very attached, for the white population. Latin American is second highest, and then we get lower attachments for Black or Asian American / Chinese, right, at 45%. Similar here, Black populations have higher degrees of attachment to their ethnic groups, right, and or racial groups rather, ethno-racial identities exhibit stronger degrees to which the Black identifiers populations say they're very attached. And homeland, country of origin, again, amongst the Asian Chinese population, Asian and Chinese rather, 31, lower than the country attached. In other words, country attachments are higher. But again, I think the key point here is that they're still a bit lower in terms of the very attached amongst the Asian American and Chinese. So the overall attached is pretty similar, by the way. So it's the intensity of the attachment that's a bit lower amongst this group. And in Canada, actually, when compared to the United States, it's much lower, right? So 34.4, 45% in the United States, and much lower, in fact, than in terms of very attached to their country, than the white, Black, and Latin American populations of Canada. But there's, again, lower attachment also to ethnic or racial group amongst the Chinese Canadian population than there is amongst the Black population, a little bit lower than it is amongst the white population. And even lower to country of origin, it's actually quite low. And these are the immigrant groups within each of these 4 segments, obviously, because they can't be non-immigrants if it's the homeland or country of origin. So what you're showing here is just lower, more depressed degrees of people identifying as Chinese in Canada who say they're very attached. So it's really more of a horizontal phenomenon. It's not, doesn't appear to be a situation where there are competing identities. Those people who have high attachments to country that are Chinese have high attachments to their, as we'll see shortly, their ethnic or racialized group or their home countries. Next. Asian Americans with stronger ethnic attachments. So that just to validate what I said earlier, if you are, this is for Asian or Asian Americans in the United States, those people who are very attached here to their ethnic group or racialized group have higher attachments to the United States, And if you're somewhat attached, you're a bit lower attachments, right? So really the demarcation is here, right? Because here it's more roughly a bit more similar. But this here is showing you that contrary to what you may hear from some observers, those people who are of Asian origin, and Asian Americans who say, I'm very attached to my cultural background or roots or minority identity, are also very attached to their country. Again, quite distinct with what we sometimes hear, which is that these two phenomenon, attachment to country, operates in opposition to attachment to ethnicity. So Robert Putnam might argue that ethnic attachments undercut national attachments, but their data doesn't validate that, not only for Asian origin populations, but also for Americans in general, right? That idea is not validated. That's an idea also, by the way, I should add, that critics of multiculturalism or similar policies will, or similar ideas will advance. They'll argue that attachments to countries of origin or cultures of origin inevitably undercut attachment to country. And that's not validated by the data in either the United States or Canada. So this is the data for Canada. Again, a similar pattern. The very attached to one's culture or racial identities is supporting attachment to country, not the inverse. And similar here, people who are attached to their countries of origin are also attached in Canada and United States, respectively, amongst Asian or Asian American and Chinese Canadians to their country. So attachments operate horizontally, basically, is what the survey suggests. They're not in opposition to each other. Now, obviously, there are cases where there are in opposition to each other in societies where, you know, the two are pitted against each other in terms of if the public discourse suggests that they're incompatible and it's a choice, and then that's going to happen, but not at least in what we see in the Canadian American data. Moving to the state of intergroup relations right now, what we see in terms of concern, where we're asking people which relationships amongst these bilateral ones have gotten worse recently, since actually the question I think asks if they've gotten worse since COVID-19, since the outbreak of COVID-19. And in Canada, the relationship that people think has deteriorated most is the one between Asians and non-Asians at 38.4%. Next, it's immigrants and non-immigrants. And after that, it's a 10 to 15 point drop in terms of other bilateral relations. Now, this poll was done in March. My sense is that you might see some change here because these patterns tend to evolve where there are sort of high profile incidents that are making people think about the issues and where the conflicts might be. And we've seen some conflictual issues amongst Indigenous, non-Indigenous. They've been ongoing, but recently in Canada, that's become a lot higher profile with the very tragic discovery of burial sites for Indigenous children and others from residential schools. So that's probably really deeply affected our perceptions about these issues. But at the time this poll was done in March, where I think the issue of discrimination and racist expression towards Chinese and Asian populations was particularly at the forefront. You know, you got this this sort of curve, if you like, or this sort of list, which puts Asian and non-Asians at the top in terms of the deterioration of relations. In the United States, again, the post-George Floyd period, you're seeing more proximity, but still more people thinking the Asian, non-Asian relationship has declined more than the Black and non-Black relationship in the United States. Immigrant, non-immigrant is highest in the United States, according to the survey done in March. My guess is, and I'm going to probe this further, there's some overlap in these two, that people who may be reclassifying or rethinking about the Asian population as immigrant, non-immigrant. But you know, we could test that further, and I will do that. Since COVID-19, again, how we describe the current relations, that was the question. So Asian Americans are more likely to say the relationship has worsened, 42.6%, than white Americans do. And in Canada, the Chinese persons identifying as Chinese are in fact much more inclined to say the relationship is worse than any of the groups surveyed, including considerably more so than Asian Americans. And those identifying as white in Canada, 35.7%, think it's worsened. Right? So that gives you a sense of the sort of dynamic between the Asian American and Chinese populations respectively, and the white identifying population in Canada and the United States. In regard to COVID-19, to what extent do you trust Americans? Actually here, if you don't trust is an important dimension in the extent in the United States to which people think the relationship has gotten worse between Asian and non-Asian. So those people who say they not at all trust Americans, amongst Asian Americans, think that the relationship, 60% think the relationship has gotten worse. Those who do trust Americans are more likely to think the relationship has either stayed the same or improved. So trust is an important factor in perceptions and attitudes around declining bilateral relations between Asians and non-Asians. Hence, in terms of a policy direction, it's important to restore trust or thicken trust. Again, keeping in mind that we don't know what the pre-COVID benchmark was for this, but we do know that trust is a critical factor in shaping people's attitudes around those relationships, and that one of the likely outcomes of the racism and discrimination we witness is diminishing trust, diminishment in trust across populations and minorities in the United States relative to the other communities and the broader majority population. So trust in general, Chinese Canadians' trust of Canadians is a good deal higher than Asian Americans' trust of Americans, right? So that's what you can see over here. So that basically, we're looking at it horizontally, not vertically at this point. So Canadians, trust of Canadians here amongst Chinese, it's 9.2%, a lot, 59.9, somewhat, not a lot, 25%, another 2.6. In the United States, trust levels are at 42, so 30 and 12, that's 42% as opposed to 26%, right? So the trust level amongst Asian Americans of Americans is higher than the trust of Chinese Canadians of Canadians in general. This is just broken down by region. So in the United States, in terms of Asian American and white respectively, and you can see in the Northeast, 44% think the relationship is worsened. Midwest, 38%. This is among Asian Americans. 37% amongst persons in the Southern United States, and 45%. So really in Northeastern United States and Western United States where the perception that relations have worsened is higher. And those are areas where there are higher concentrations, I would suggest, although Min can correct me if I'm wrong, of persons of Asian origins in the United States. In Canada, the sample size only permits us to do British Columbia and Ontario. British Columbia has the highest proportion of persons that are Chinese in Canada, and you can see 64% of persons identifying as Chinese here in British Columbia think the relationship is worsened, and that's far exceeding any of the percentages or numbers we've seen so far in that regard. And in Ontario, quite high also at 50% relative to the numbers we saw in various regions of the United States, with only the western part of the United States at 45% coming somewhat closer to that. Does trust affect attachment? In other words, does trust of Americans affect attachment to country amongst Asian Americans? Yes, it does actually. Trust in general does have a bearing on attachment to country, as we can see by sort of looking at this. If you trust Americans a lot, you have a higher sense of attachment to the United States. So that would suggest that the risk is, in effect, a diminishing of attachment to country when you sort of break the bonds of trust. But what it does, which I suspect Robert Putnam, if he were, reading this, would say, yes, that's exactly what he's saying. But what we didn't show you is that ethnic attachments don't undercut attachment to country, but trust can undercut such attachment. It's just that by definition, ethnic attachments do not imply diminished trust. So here again, in regard to COVID-19, to what extent do you trust Canadians? Of a similar phenomenon, although on a lesser overall scale, right? Trust does not have the same type of overall impact, but it does vary for white and Chinese respectively, identifying with those groups. It does have, this is on ethnic or racial group attachments actually. So trust does affect ethnic or racial group attachments as well in Canada. Right, and that's the figures for the United States. Also, just trust generally, lower trust generally undercuts identities across the proverbial board. This is for Canada, same thing. So that's what we were looking at earlier. Trust in Canadians amongst white and Chinese populations does, lower trust does mean less attachment. Higher trust means greater attachment. That's it. So that's the presentation. A fair bit to think about and to continue to explore. And hopefully, your comments and questions will help us in that regard. And I'll pass back to Jill, or back to who, by virtue of that, passed to Min. Right, so.
Go for it, Min.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you for giving the overall picture of the data on attachment, trust, and intergroup relations. So, let's see. So what I'm trying to do now is to first recap the pattern that Jack just highlighted for us, but with a focus on the intra-group pattern among Asian Americans and Chinese Canadians. And then I would shed some light on the diversity within an ethnic group and across host country contexts to understand these patterns from the cross-sectional data. I'm trying to.
Everything okay?
Yeah, somehow I'm trying to get to my text. Okay, yeah. So in terms of attachment, Jack just now showed us several points, takeaway points. So first is Asian Americans and Chinese Canadians have higher attachment to their host country meaning their adopted homeland, than to their own ethnic group or home country. But the overall attachment is lower when compared to other racial ethnic groups. And the pattern differs between Asian Americans and Chinese Canadians. So there is the cross-country difference. And Asian Americans are more attached than Chinese Canadians to their host country and then their own ethnic group and home country. The second point that Jack, the data shows is Asian Americans and Chinese Canadians who are attached to their ethnic group also feel very attached to their host country. So there is no competing identity there to repeat. And third point is Asian Americans and Chinese Canadians who are attached to their own ethnic group also feel very attached to the host country. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself here. So here is the table that, that Jack just showed, but I want to highlight that Asian Americans and Chinese Canadians here, their attachment to their host country, to their own ethnic group, and to their home country is relatively lower than when compared to other groups. And then there is also a cross-country difference. And then Asian Americans and Chinese Canadians who are attached to their own ethnic group also feel attached to the host country. So that's what Jack is highlighted. So if you see the red figure, it's very clear that there is no competing identity between your own ethnicity and the host country. And the next one is if you are very attached to your country of origin, that does not competing your attachment to the host country, right? So if you are seeing the red figure. And then to recap too, is on trust and intergroup relations. Jack's data also show that Asian Americans are more likely than white to agree that relations between Asians and non-Asians worsened after COVID-19. But the perceived gap, this perception gap in relations is wider in Canada than in the United States. So that's quite interesting. I don't know how to make of it. So in Canada, 55% versus of Asian Chinese Canadians versus 36% white think that Asian non-Asian relations worsen. And in the US, the percentage is a lot lower, given the situation of very severe anti-Asian racism in the United States than in Canada. So this pattern is a bit counterintuitive. And then the other point is those Asian Americans who are least inclined to trust Americans are most likely to think the relations between Asian and non-Asian have worsened. So in other words, trust does have an impact on Asian Americans' perception of intergroup relations. And Asian Americans' trust of Americans is significantly lower than Chinese Canadians' trust of Canadians. So that's the figure showing what I just said. And then recap number 3 is the perception of worsened Asian, non-Asian relations is stronger in places where Asians are highly concentrated. So that's a very interesting pattern showing in the data. That is 44% of Asian Americans in the West and actually 46%, I just had an error here. 46% of Asian Americans in the West and 44% in the Northeast perceive that the relationship between Asian and non-Asians have were worsened since COVID-19, compared to 39% in the Midwest versus 37% in the South. So geographic concentration of Asians in the West and Northeast does have an impact on their perception. And then in contrast, similarly in Canada too, 64% of Chinese Canadians in British Columbia and 50% in Ontario perceive worsen Asian, non-Asian relations. And again, Chinese are highly concentrated in British Columbia and in Ontario. Recap number 4 is the correlation between trust and attachment. And Jack's figures shows that lower trust to whites, white Americans or white Canadians is correlated with lower attachment among Asians to their host country. In the US, stronger attachment to ethnic group among Asians is associated with higher trust to other Americans. In other words, it's important to understand, the stick of trust in terms of the ethnic group's attachment. In Canada, higher trust of Canadians among Chinese Canadians contributes to higher attachment to host country. So these are some of the recap of the points that that Jack made, and I want to secondly to provide some context in understanding these inter-country patterns. So first, I want to highlight the importance of understanding intra-group diversity, that is heterogeneity within an ethnic group. So when we talk about Asian Americans, we are talking about Asian Americans in the aggregate, even though I believe that the survey data on Asian Americans in the United States have a high proportion oversampling of Chinese. So Chinese are way overrepresented in the Asian American sample, but still in understanding Asian Americans in the US is the smallest racial group and the fastest growing group in the US. And the growth is not due to natural growth, since Asian Americans have very low natural birth rate. Rather, it's the growth is due to immigration. So at present, there were about 22 million people, Americans of Asian descent. It comprised of 6.5% of the US population. So it's a much smaller racial ethnic group. So among Asian Americans, we have the big six, right? Chinese is the largest group, and then next is Indians, next is Filipino, and fourth one is Vietnamese, and then Korean and Japanese. All these big six groups have population over 1 million people. So Chinese are the largest Asian origin group, is at a bit more than 5 million. But it's only 1.4% of the total US population and 23% of the Asian population. So when we talk about Asian Americans, Chinese is just a part of it, a fraction of it. And then Indians and Filipinos, they are over 4 million people, and Vietnamese, it's 2 million, and Japanese and Koreans is a bit over 1 million. So besides the big six, we also have 7 other Asian origin group that has population over 200,000. That is Pakistani, Thai, Hmong, Laotian, Cambodian, and Taiwanese, and Bangladesh. And then the US census also count 10 more of smaller national origin group from Asia. By the way, in the United States, what is categorized as Asian American is anywhere, is people whose descent from anywhere east of Afghanistan. So in other words, Central Asia is not part of the Asian American kind of group. So in Canada, Asians are also the largest and fastest growing group. And I believe the growth is also due to international migration. But so in comparison to the US, the Asian population is much smaller. However, the relative proportion is a lot higher, right? Asians are only 6.5% of the total US population, but it's nearly 18% of the Canadian population. So the size does matter in understanding the intergroup dynamics. And then the Chinese are the largest Asian origin group, and the proportion is a lot higher. So it's 1.6 million people of Chinese descent in Canada. It's 5% of the total Canadian population. So as contrast to 1.5% of the US population, and then 27% of the Asian population. So among the Chinese, the mainlanders are the majority, followed by Hong Kongers and Taiwanese. And in the United States, that proportion also is similar, except that the Hong Kongers and the Taiwanese, they are kind of in half and half, like Hong Kong is 15%, and then Taiwan, the Taiwanese is about 16, 17%. And then in Canada, again, in terms of geographic concentration, the Chinese are very highly concentrated, for that matter, Asian Americans too, in the West and Northeast. However, within each region, they are more dispersed within region. So you see the pattern of both concentration and dispersion. For example, in Los Angeles, you will see that eastern part of Los Angeles, like eastern suburb, you see what we call the Chinese ethnoburb. And there are a lot of satellite cities, the municipalities that has a high proportion of Chinese or Asian population. However, if you are looking at Los Angeles Chinese population or Asian American population in general, they are also very spread out within the metropolitan area. So on the one hand, there is a high visibility in certain areas, but in terms of population dispersion, they are also quite dispersed. And the Northeast, same pattern, right? They are highly concentrated in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, the tri-state metropolitan area, but then they are also quite dispersed within the broader northeastern region of the United States. And in Canada, the Asians or the Chinese, especially the Chinese, are more concentrated in southwestern BC and southern Ontario, as well as central Alberta. And that has to do with the immigration history, the long history of resettlement there in the the Rockies and central Alberta area. And then because of different immigration policy orientations, Chinese Americans, especially in the United States, are socioeconomically more diverse and geographically more concentrated than Chinese Canadians. Now, the policy orientation, even though Canada also have a strong focus on family unification, but Canada also have a policy, the point system that allows highly skilled immigrants, especially from mainland China, to migrate to Canada. Whereas in the US, even though we have the skill, the H-1B, with the pathway to green card and citizenship, but still you see a higher diversity from socioeconomic characteristics, with a high proportion of college graduates, but also a quite visible and high proportion of college of people without a high school degree in the US. And then I would like to also highlight some of the things that are happening after COVID-19, especially in the United States, that affect Asian, non-Asian relations, as well as the perception of these relations. So, so we all know that anti-Asian hate and violence has risen very rapidly since COVID-19. But again, COVID-19 is the anti-Asian hate has historical kind of roots of those, and COVID-19 is just kind of invoked the historical hate and historical racism and stereotype of Chinese and Asian Americans. So the Stop AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander Hate website, has recorded since March 2020, 6,600 incidents of anti-Asian racism across the country. And this this reporting ranges from verbal attack, like just call your name and ask you to get out of the country, scapegoating China, blaming China for the spread of the virus, anti-Asian, anti-immigrant nativism, saying that stay in your country where you belong. I myself actually encountered some of those, and I also got shoved off the street when I was walking on the street. But I did not report. So there are a lot of underreporting there. And then there is also racist characterization of Chinese as bread eaters, dirty habits, and historically, Chinese also had that kind of stereotype. And then racial slurs, not only calling names, but also, using the derogative term, calling you out, like chain Chinaman. And then March 16, Atlanta spa killings, that kind of heightened the both American conscious about anti-Asian hate and also within Asian American community to arouse anger and outrage, and particularly Asian American action, movement for racial equality. So in the United States, this kind of thing is, you can find direct link to COVID-19, but I would also argue that COVID-19 is kind of facilitate the historical racism to arise on the surface, and kind of embolden some of the, some people to, to say this, to discriminate against Asians, feeling that they had the right to do so. So to conclude, well, actually, I don't have a conclusion, and we don't have a conclusion. Jack and I would welcome your comments so that we can go dig deeper in the data and write a report or paper with more in-depth analysis. So I want to highlight some of the factors to be considered when we are thinking about what affects attachment, trust in the group relations. So one is the demographic and socioeconomic characteristics of the group, and also we need to think about the ethnic composition in a specific locale, like a different level of the geographic locale, as well as the ethnic community formation, to see, whether the role of a pre-existing or new ethnic community, in what way the ethnic community affect trust, intergroup relations, and attachment. And then we also have to think about the historical and contemporary trends of racism and stereotyping of a group, as well as we have not talked much about the media framing. So the media framing of the issue and also the media reporting of the group would have impact on these factors. And very importantly, I would call attention to the rise of China in the global stage, as well as the resulting US-China competition and US-China relations, for that matter, Canadian-China relations. And that would have a big impact, I imagine, on perception of trust, attachment to host and home countries, as well as on ethnic group and intergroup relations. So I'll stop from here. We are also sorry that Paul could not be here to serve as a discussant, since Professor Paul Ong, my colleague at UCLA, he is doing a lot of very good research at how COVID-19 impact ethnic groups and ethnic communities in Los Angeles, as well as in the US. So, but he promised to send us comments. So we would welcome your questions and comments for us to think more deeply about these patterns. Thank you.
So, Jill, there were two questions. I answered both of them online as they appeared in writing. One of them I actually wasn't able to answer very easily, and it was a question about the extent to which attachment was lower amongst Chinese Canadians compared to Asian Americans, pretty much across the board, right? For all, whether it was geographic / geo-national attachments or cultural attachments. I really am not in a position to answer that. I think there's more, I need to examine further before providing an answer. There's another question. I did want to make a comment, although just following up on something Min had mentioned, and it was about, if I understood this correctly, that the extent of discrimination towards Chinese populations in the United States was worse than in Canada, right? I think you may have said that, right? And I think it's true that overtly or whatever, it does appear worse. But I'm beginning to think, it's a thesis I want to test, that there's something that's becoming not borderless, but where the borders of the racist expression are not as important as they may have been 10, 15, 20 years ago as social media keeps advancing. I think people will see a widespread expression of racism next door geographically, as being as impactful here as it is in the United States. So by comparison to the George Floyd issue, it would have been possible to say that's happening in the United States. But when you did polling in Canada, a lot of people said that what's happening in the United States is happening here to the same extent. Right? It was sort of something that people, sort of provided that immediate reaction or observation. And I'm beginning to feel some of it is a function of social media, right? Because a lot of the anti-Asian and anti-Black discrimination that people are seeing it through social media, right? Or we're getting a lot of American news piped in here, so we may not be making those fine geographic distinctions that we were before. If you're, Chinese in Canada or Chinese in the United States, you may just think that this is happening everywhere. And if it happens in the United States, it's also happening here. It may not be as visible, but it's still happening. And similar for persons identifying as Black with respect to George Floyd. The only other thing I also want to add in a secondary point is, we didn't ask about the state of relations between Asians and non-Asians. We asked whether they got worse. So by virtue of doing that, it begs the question of what the starting point was, what your starting point was. So, and underlying that is a question of expectations. So if you thought the relationship was really, really good in one country and it was okay in the other country, right, then the perception of it getting worse may have a differential impact on you, right? So if you see like in BC, people thought it got a lot worse, but they might have thought it was actually better up at the, at the front in their mind, in the pre-COVID period, than say Chinese populations or identifying Chinese populations in Western United States, right? So that's where we need to sort of square that circle between what their perception, which we don't have, was of that relationship before we got to COVID and how they saw it evolve, right? So,
Could I add? I appreciate those questions. Those are really good questions for us to think more deeply. Regarding why there is such difference between attachment of Chinese Canadians and Asian Americans exists, and I could, like, from kind of my anecdotal observation with the Chinese American community here, my hunch, now this is non-scientific, my hunch is that that has to do with the US and Canada's position in the world. That's for one. And second is the policy, the multicultural policy in Canada. And in the US, multiculturalism is in the name, right? It's more English only and stuff. So in the US, people are less open, how to say, like they feel that if they report less attachment, then they would be a suspect. Whereas that concern may not be as severe in Canada because Canada's kind of multicultural policy. But again, that does not necessarily highly correlated with your really
The
the
results,
trust or,
yeah.
or attachment. So in a way, if you are in a more free environment, then you could, say things that are less consequential, but in a more in a less open environment,
Yeah.
like in the United States, especially when U.S.-China relations gets worsened, then people would feel the urge to prove their loyalty,
Yeah,
so
no, I
that they
understand.
won't be
Yeah,
considered suspect. So
And that
there
would be
is
an
some
important-
factors on that.
That'd be an important area to do further research, and we can do further research. And I have a new survey, I haven't released it yet, but doesn't ask this scope of questions. It just looks at China-Canada relations, and it
Right.
looks at opinion of Chinese people in Canada. But generally, if I ask about opinion of Chinese people in Canada, Canadians will give you very positive, in the overall percentage is positive if you ask the question that way, right? They'll give you much more negative if I in the same survey which I have, I put Muslims. People have much more openly expressed in these surveys, even though they're confidential. Right? I mean, I've always found that a bit of a paradox. The survey is confidential, but people are willing to openly express their negative feelings towards groups, right? But more so Muslims, less so Chinese. That's been pretty consistent across a lot of surveys. So that hasn't changed very much. But I do agree it would be interesting to see whether the international or global relationships, which have also really deteriorated in terms of the Canada-China relationship, how people who feel that those relationships deteriorated feel about the domestic, intra-group relations, which I've not really done that comparison. We can do that in the next survey, actually, to be fair. I think good advice to add that question, which we'll do. On the multicultural issue, it's interesting. I've really gone through an evolution in my thinking on that based on the survey work that we've been doing, because we've done a lot of Canada-US polling this past 18 months, apart from the CIHR polling. When I asked the sort of standard question about multiculturalism, which is, do you think immigrants should give up their customs and traditions and become more like other Americans or other Canadians? There isn't much of a difference in Canada and the United States. So Canada is more, we're de jure multicultural, but there's a pocket, not a significant minority. In my home province of Quebec, not a minority, but actually a majority of people who would like to see immigrants, who say on that survey question, immigrants should give up their customs and traditions and become more like everyone else. And so United States, it's a bit, it's more complex, right? The Quebec factor falling into the equation, which is more sort of, which is paradoxical because it's sort of a minority, a population that sees itself as a minority in North America, the French population, right, wants to protect its culture and feels others have to give up theirs in order to protect the majority culture in Quebec, which is a minority in North America, right? So it's a bit of a funny portrait in a way, that way. In United States, there's still this sort of freedom of cultural choice. So there's an assimilationist view, but it's because we give you so much freedom, you choose to melt, so to speak. So you don't, I just think we've seen more complexity in that paradigm of one melting pot, one multicultural, country. And I think it's more the mixed salad in both countries. It feels like there's a salad bowl in both countries. And so things are a bit more mixed, right, than we might assume. But I'm thinking about that, actually. And now that I'm thinking about it, we are running a conference this fall, October 6th to 8th, for the 50th anniversary of Canadian multiculturalism. We had a very heavy return on our call for proposals where we extended it 2 weeks. So those Canadians who are currently, or Americans currently on this call, on this rather video conference platform, the call for papers is still up. And if I may just take this 10-second publicity, for our conference in the fall, I guess I've just done that. So.
Yeah, and talking about the multiculturalism and then the open society in the United States, I'm not sure about Canada. So in the United States, it's interesting that those who are living in the ethnic enclave, living and working in the ethnic enclave, they are kind of more holding a assimilationist view. They want their children to learn English. They want their children to, to get a good education, to, to melt into the mainstream, more so than the middle class who are in dispersed communities. Like those who are living in dispersed communities, structurally very assimilated. In a way, they are more inclined than their working class co-ethnic living in the enclave to enforce like language, their home language, parental language and culture on their children. So in a way, the bicultural conflict is more intense that way. So it's a bit counterintuitive.
I mean, there's also, I don't know how it plays out in the US as much, and you're much more knowledgeable about these things. But in Canada, in terms of some of the research I've done on language issues amongst Chinese populations in particular, where we've had a very rooted Cantonese speaking population in Canada. And so waves of immigration have really created some, ethnic differences amongst the Chinese population in Canada that don't get a lot of attention, actually. We like to think of, for census purposes, we like to think of everyone who's of Chinese background as simply Chinese, right? But we have we have diversified a bit of the census categories in terms of Chinese languages, right? There's a bit more diversity that we introduced about 2006, right? So you'll see Shanghainese, actually, you'll see dialects in some of our census, collection as regards languages. But I don't know how that plays out differently, in terms of the population. I expect there's some similarities in terms of the population evolution of persons coming from parts of China to the United States as there is in Canada. But there's still an older established Cantonese speaking group in Canada. So
yeah. One of the interesting thing to observe is like the Hongkongers, right? Their children, the extent to which their children maintain Cantonese in comparison to the Taiwanese in the United States, because from the data here in the US, the children of Taiwanese immigrants, their proportion of maintaining or having reported fluency in Mandarin is a lot higher than the children of mainlanders controlling for socioeconomic characteristics.
Interesting. I mean, also China is undergoing, or has at least, things are fluctuating, a lot of conversation and discussion about its ethnic minorities. And the relationship of its Han majority population to the ethnic minority populations. I don't know if that has any impact here at all in the diaspora, but there are also a lot of repatriated, Chinese populations that sort of live in two places here in Canada, right? So they've got, they're in Canada, and there are different citizenship regimes too in Canada, United States, which may have some impact on this as well. So,
in Canada, we call it transnationalism, right? The routine travel back and forth for routine life. I would imagine among the Chinese, Canada the proportion is higher. In the United States, you think it's high, but actually in a survey that from our study in the early 2000s, the proportion of those who are actually conduct transnationalism, that is routinely going back and forth, is the proportion is very small, less than 10%. And it's among those who have citizenship status, who are male, who are married, who have higher socioeconomic background. And others, you think that they practice transnationalism. Actually, they do not.
Yeah. So just to answer Andrew Tomeyer's question on the second one, what will be the next steps from your results? That was what Min and I were just discussing. Some of that was a next step from these results, basically. There's some of the avenues we want to look into for the researching. And the first question, what promising practice you found research to reduce the problems seen and increase trust? Well, again, we'll have to, in the next wave of our survey, which should be out this month, we'll have to start looking at relationships between discrimination and trust, which we didn't do here. And so my sense would be reducing discrimination would be one way to, reestablish or restore levels of trust. We'll test that thesis in the hypothesis in the next survey, but that would be one way to, I think, do that. And you apologize if you missed it, but was the US data collected before or after the presidential administration? It was collected after the change in the presidential administration. So we'll have to see what, you're right, we'll look at what visible differences there are. We do have data from last year on discrimination, actually, during the Trump administration. So we will be able to do some comparisons, and it will be worth doing those comparisons, I would think. So, so those are the, I hope, Andrew, that satisfies your questions.
Would you have a similar answer to Natalia's question about, can you speak to policies that can facilitate attachment to Canada and the US among groups that experience lower levels of attachment? Would it be reducing discrimination as well, or?
So lower levels of attachment, again, we need to better understand what explains the lower across the board attachments for Chinese, Canadian and American Asian, but particularly Chinese Canadian populations. It is counterintuitive, as Min was saying, relative to what we usually think. Because we usually think in multicultural, discursively multicultural countries, right? That higher openness to diversity and encouraging people to preserve their customs and traditions will create stronger attachments, but that's not what it's showing us necessarily. And there is, again, as I said, in our polling showing a lot of commonality in terms of the idea of freedom, the freedom to express oneself culturally in both countries. Because really, is it really about us going out and saying, we're going to encourage you strongly to preserve your customs and traditions? I mean, we're not providing substantially greater resources to do that. We're not providing funding for minority language schooling. In Canada, we have an official language policy, right? We expect you to learn English and French, and increasingly, we want people who in the pre-arrival period to be able to speak either English or French, right? So we have in discourse, yeah, we're basically saying, I think, when we say we have a multicultural policy, that the proxy for preserving your customs and traditions is really giving you the freedom to choose to do that, but not providing you with substantial resources to support that necessarily. Right? Now, I'm not saying they do that in the United States either, but it's the same type of message, contrary to what people think. It's, United States, a country, we have the freedom to make those choices. Now, we're going to have different types of pressures that are going to be exerted in the society for you to conform with certain things, notably English. But, again, in Canada, by comparison, we're not providing you with the resources to sustain that. Though, there may be some afternoon school programs that do that, but I don't know that the United States, they don't have afternoon school programs that communities organize if they so choose to do that, so.
Yeah, I would like to add that just now I went to the previous session, Monica's paper, Monica Boyd's paper shows that that trust, and our data also show that trust affects attachment, right? And then the trust, there are different levels of trust, individual trust as well as institutional trust. So she highlights the different categories of trust that is available in our data, which we can dig deeper. And one of the interesting patterns she showed that among those who are attached, who trust religious leaders, they tend to have religion as an organization, as an institution, tend to help with increasing trust. So we don't have the data on the civil society or ethnic community organization, but we do have data on religion, right? On the on the trust to religious institution. versus the trust on government or health official or
I guess another, a dimension of this in terms of cultural transmission, linguistic cultural transmission is a degree of mixing, right?
Mhm.
So where there's more, historically, where there's more interethnic mixing, or in this case, because ethno-racial characteristics, there'll be some in practice, when I look at data, more mixing it results in more cultural loss, right? If you'd like, right? So, so if someone who's of Chinese origin marries someone who's not Chinese origin, and disproportionately, if the mom is the one who's the not Chinese origin, then there's a higher chance that the language will diminish, right? So that's another so some communities where there's less mixing have better chance of retention in terms of intergenerational transmission of languages, right? So I think that'd be another factor. I don't know what that looks like in Canada, United States, and it's going to vary across different parts of the United States depending on the concentration of communities. Right, you've got a high concentration of Chinese populations in a city like Vancouver, right? So I would think that some of our data is probably affected by that high concentration, which permits you to retain. That'll permit you to retain your cultures more than more than policies in place, right? I would suggest, so that'd be another factor to consider. I mean, I did a publication 20 years ago on ethnic origin and heritage languages in Canada, and I looked at 6 non-official languages, and that was one of the main factors in retention of non-official heritage languages, was the rate of mixing. So where you had more multiple identifiers on the basis of ethnicity, you had weaker language transmission across generations. I should actually look at that book again. Maybe I'll redo it 20 years later.
Yeah. Language is definitely important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so we're at 3:42. That's 3 minutes left. I can't believe it. This is like 2 sessions consecutively where I'm under the, I made it under the full time slot, and I'm talking slower to top it all off.
It was a pretty enriching conversation, though. If anyone has anything to add from our audience in the comments and in the chat, please go ahead. But I'd say there's some good points made about trust affects attachment, but then we don't assume that what was it? The perception, that trust has an impact, that ethnic attachments do not imply diminished trust. That was also a nice point there. Yeah.
I mean, the other first thing to consider is that trust, even though there's a lot of attention that's been directed at the phenomenon of trust in the past 20 years by sociologists, and it can be a very fluid concept, trust, right? There's a sponginess to trust, right? You can see trust diminish really, really quickly in a society if there's like a very, very bad incident, right, that occurs.
Right.
In many ways, so that's where it becomes important to measure over time. Right?
I agree. So that's why I'm looking forward to the next wave of data collection.
Yeah.
That would allow us to look at the fluidity of those concepts.
No, I agree. Because you would think, I've been thinking about this a bit lately, you would think in a global pandemic or a crisis of this nature, that it would create more solidarity, right, between people. Like we'd come together because we're fighting a common invisible enemy that's attacking us all, that's borderless and doesn't distinguish between us in terms of who gets infected. But that isn't what happened in the past 18 months. Yeah. There was a lot of every person or every country for themselves. Right. So anyway, a parting thought.
Mm-hmm. And when is the next poll happening on this?
We are going to the field this month. So
okay.
We'll be going to the field this month, but we're going to tweak things a bit more. We already had the poll done. We keep tweaking things because the issues are changing. So now we've got to look at the questions, but the variant, and which we weren't doing, say, 2 months ago as much, so that if the issues would stop changing, it would make things a lot easier for us to, to just, but we're going to have to eventually cut it off at a certain point. That's it. These are the questions, no more changes. And we're just going forward into the field. So, which is where we are, I think, right now.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you, Min, and thank you, Jack, on behalf of everyone here. Thank you for attending as
Oh,
well.
thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
man.
Jill.
Really appreciate it.
Thank
Thank you,
you,
Jill.
Jack.
Great job.
Yeah.
Great job chairing this thing, Jill.
Thank you.
Bye.
It's a pleasure.